Shalom everyone, hope everyone's doing well. Mizat Hashem, today in Masechet Sanhedrin, we're going to continue on with Tet Zayin Amud Aleph 16a, and we'll begin at the very bottom of Tet Vav Amud Bet, Amar of Matna, where we left off yesterday. We're going to have three sections in today's learning. The first section is going to try to clarify for us what it means that a shevet is adjudicated by the court of 71, which we left off with the discussion yesterday. The second section will be the sources that navi, sheker, and Kohen Gadol are adjudicated with the court of 71 as well. And then the third and final section will be a discussion how we know in order to go to milchemet hareshut, a voluntary war, the Sanhedrin had to be consulted and permission received from them as well. Be'ezrat Hashem, as always, our learning today should be as a source, a zechut of refuah shleima, of a speedy, quick, and full recovery for Jacob Yaakov ben Dinah, and we should only hear B'sarot Tovot, good news. B'sat Hashem, let's get started, the bottom of Tet Vav Amud Bet. So let's remember where we're holding here. We had yesterday that the Mishnah told us that a shevet, a tribe, is adjudicated by the court of 71. So meaning if the court seemingly sinned in some way, then they would require the highest level of Jewish court, like the Supreme Court of Judaism, to adjudicate their case. So we tried to figure out yesterday what exactly was the Aveira we were talking about. And the attempt that the Gemara made first was Chilul Shabbat, that was refuted. Then we tried with Avodah Zarah, but the issue with saying that was we said Avodah Zarah, which would be considered an Ir Nidachat, a wayward city. If an entire city engaged in Avodah Zarah, so then they're judged differently. Actually, the punishment is sayif, they killed by the sword, as opposed to skila if an individual does avodah zarah. And also the wayward city is adjudicated by the court of 71 versus the normal capital cases in the court of 23. The problem with that answer, the Gemara said, is this shevet does not fit the description of an Ir Nidachat, because we had a machloket Tanaim, but the greatest size that would fit the bill of an Ir Nidachat is most of a shevet, but not the entire shevet. So turning the bottom of Tet Vav Amud Bet, the Gemara now tells us a accepted answer. Amar of Matna, Rav Matna says, Hacha, what are we talking about that requires a court of 71? We say a shevet, turning to Tet Zayin Amud Aleph, Benasi shevet shechata askinan. We're talking about where the nasi of a shevet did an aveira, meaning in a situation where the nasi, it means, that's what it means, shevet. It means the representative, the leader of the shevet, the nasi, the prince, if he sins in a way that's capital punishment, meaning it requires capital punishment, he's not judged by a normal capital court of 23, but rather he needs a judgment by the court of 71. Askina, that's what we're talking about. Because Milo Amar Ravada Barahava, isn't Ravada Barahava going to tell us later that we know in Parashat Yitro suggests revamping the court system. And he tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Kol hadavar hagadol yaviu elecha. Now literally what it means is, when the lower courts can't deal with some sort of a very difficult case, a big case, so they'll bring it to you. Kol hadavar hagadol simply means a great matter should be brought to you. And Moshe is like a court of 71, he represents them. So he's like the Sanhedrin Agdolah. But the way that Ravada Barahava interprets the verse is, not any great thing should be brought to you, but rather dvarav shel gadol, when there is a matter of the great people. Means if there is an adjudication of a capital case of the nasi, that needs to be dealt with by you, by Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe is like the court of 71. Hainami gadolhu, this also, if a nasi sins in a way that he'll be chayav mitah, who needs to adjudicate? Moshe, or like Moshe, a court of 71. So that's the source. And we'll get more into that later when we talk about the Kohen Gadol. So this is the accepted teretz number 1 at least, which is when it says the Mishnah, Shevet is judged by 71, it means if the Nasi of the Shevet sins in a capital way, he's judged by the court of 71. Ula Amar Ula says, Amar Belazar, Bevayin aliskena chalot. We're talking about when it says that he gives another attempted answer. When it says that the shevet is judged by 71, it means if two shvatim, two tribes are arguing over the boundaries between their portions in the land of Israel, that needs to be determined, figured out by a court of 71. What's the logic? Uketchilata shel Eretz Yisrael, just like the original distribution and splitting up of the land of Israel. Just as originally when it was split up in the days of Yeshua, they had the court of 71 as part of that process. So if there needs to be a determination as to the borders of land, because there's some argument, you also need the court of 71 to be involved. The problem with this answer, says the Gemara, is just as in the beginning, days of Yeshua ben Nun was divided up with other important parts too, which is that they had these pieces of parchment put into a lottery system. They also had the Urim Mitumim, which was in the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. There was a Shem of Hashem, a name of Hashem, that when you would ask the Urim Mitumim, the Choshen a question, the Urim Mitumim, this name of Hashem, would cause the stones of the breastplate of the Choshen to light up. And that was used in the original distribution of the land, the Chol Yisrael and all the Jewish people. So maybe, not only do you need 71, Afkan Kalpi, Urim Mitumim, Chol Yisrael, you should also need that when there's some sort of a border dispute. So Ella, the Gemara says that can't be the Pshat in the Mishnah, Mechavarta K'Rav Matna. Rather, let's return to, it's more clear, like the original Pshat, Rav Matna means the Nasi of a shevet. Ravina says a second answer in our Mishnah, which is accepted. And he says, Le'olam b'shevet shudach. Really, we're talking about a situation where a tribe committed avodah zarah. That's what ended up happening. We said, l'chor, they don't fit the bill of irani dachat. So what we're going to answer is, it's true. They won't be punished with the death of an irani dachat, which is skila, as opposed to saif, because they don't fit the bill as those two Tanaim spoke about before. But in terms of the number of courts that need to adjudicate, they are included. They would require a court of 71. Let's read that inside. Says the Gemara, but you asked, how could you say they're adjudicated like the sin of the multitudes, of the masses, when they do avodah zarah? We saw the Tanaim say that the greatest number of people that could be adjudicated like that, with 71, l'chaura, is referring to only most of a shevet, but not a full shevet. The Gemara says no. Afal gav de katlinan biyachid. Even though it's true, they're killed like a yachid, meaning for a yachid who does avodah zarah, the death is skila. So these people too, a shevet will also receive skila if they do avodah zarah. So in that way, like Rabbi Yoshi and Rabbi Yonatan told us before, they're like individuals. But beidina de rabim daininan le, nonetheless, they're adjudicated by a court of 71. Like the court, like the case of Irani Dachat, because Milo Amar Abichama Bar Rabbi Yossi Amar Boshaya, it's based on a similar drasha, because it says in the pasuk V'otzeta et ha'isha hu o et ha'isha hi. It says regarding a person who does avodah zarah v'gomer, so they're brought out to a court of 23. Also that they're judged with skila. So the way we deduce from the pasuk is like this: Ish v'isha tamotzi l'sharecha. A man or an individual woman, they are brought out lisharecha, which means to a court of 23. But an entire city that does avodah zarah is not brought out to a court of 23, rather to a court of 71. So similarly, just like an entire city, if an individual does avodah zarah, it's brought out to 23. Like a full city, so too is a full shevet, even though they won't receive the way of death of irani dachat, which is through saif, actually, beheading, but rather they're going to receive skila, like the individuals. They're adjudicated by the 71-person court, like the irani dachat, based on this exclusion. Let's move on now to the second section. Lo et navi sheker. We said in the Mishnah that a navi sheker, which is a prophet, a false prophet, who prophesies that Hashem had sent him to deliver certain messages, but it was fake. So he needs to be also judged by a court of 71 to put him to death. So Menani, the Gemara says, how do we know this? Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, what's the uniqueness? Atya hazada hazada mi zaken mamre. We have a gzera shava from zaken mamre. Zaken mamre we've spoken about before. It's a rabbi who rebels or refuses to accept the psak of the 71-person court. If he goes back and paskins after the 71-person court has paskin against him, and he paskins against them still, so he has to be put to death. So the Gemara says we have a gzera shava from there. Just as regarding the Zaken Mamre, in order for him to be put to death, he has to rebel against the court of 71. Afkan, it uses the word Hazada by the Navi Sheker, b'shivim ve'echad, it has to be put to death with a court of 71. Now Rashi points out, what are the psukim? Kedai to note for the next step. The Gemara says the psukim is, Rashi says, it says, Second, it says regarding the Zaken Mamre, the Navi Sheker, it says, Ach HaNavi Asher Yazid. It says, the Navi that will intentionally testify or profess that Hashem sent him and say over statements that Hashem never said. And it also says, Yazid V'Aish Asher Ya'aseh B'Zadon, that if the Zaken Mamre will rebel against the court, the 71-person court. So this is regards to when the Zaken Mamre is killed. He'll only be killed if he acts intentionally against that 71-person, the psak of the 71-person court. Asks the Gemara, the problem with this drasha is, where does it say that by Zaken Mamre, this word Zadon? It's talking about when he's put to death. Now regarding where he's put to death, that's not an association with the 71-person court. In terms of his refusal to accept psak, that refers to the 71-person court. But the pasuk of Zadon that's said by the Zaken Mamre is actually in regards to when he's put to death. And he's put to death with a 23-person court like any capital case. So Vaha Azada Kiktiva asks the Gemara, that word Azada by Zaken Mamre, Biktala Diktiva, it's regarding when he's put to death, Biktala Be'esrim Mitlatahu, and we know he's put to death with a 23-person court. So then maybe if we make B'Gzera Shava, we should say also Navi Sheker is adjudicated with a court of 23. So Elam Reish Lakish says that can't be the source. Rather, Gamar Davar Mehamra'ato. We have Gzera Shava, again, it still compares Zaken Mamre to Navi Sheker, but it says Davar. Davar is stated where the Zaken Mamre rebels against the 71-person court, and it also says it by the Navi Sheker. As Rashi explains over here, by the Navi Sheker, it says Asher Yazid Lidaber Davar, and regards to the Zaken Mamre, it also says Vasit al Pia Davar. He goes and paskins based on the rebellious psak, which is in regards to refusing the 71-person court. Asks the Gemara, but if that's true, Zaken Mamre v'ligmar Zada min Navi Sheker. Now that you're telling me there's a Gzera Shava that links the rebellion of the Zaken Mamre to the outcome that the Navi Sheker is adjudicated by a court of 71, so now keep the original Gzera Shava in place of Hazada, and you should maybe conclude that just as Navi Sheker is put to death with a court of 71, so maybe the Zaken Mamre is also put to death with a court of 71. So the Gemara answers with a big yesod, as Rashi explains here, Davar Gamir. The Tana who brought this source had a tradition from his Rebbe, the Gzera Shava of Davar, Hazada lo Gamir. But the other Gzera Shava of Hazada, he didn't have that tradition. In order to make a Gzera Shava, there has to be a tradition from his Rebbe back to Moshe Rabbeinu that there is such a Gzera Shava. Now initially the Gemara must have thought, perhaps this is a Gzera Shava with tradition. But in conclusion we're saying that's not with any tradition, so you wouldn't be able to deduce that the Zaken Mamre is put to death in a court of 71, although his rebellion has to be against the court of 71 for him to be put to death in the court of 23. Let's move on. Now, we had said that the Navi Sheker is put to death by a court of 71. And similarly, if a Kohen Gadol, as we'll see later, acts in some sort of an Aveira that would require capital punishment, he would also be judged by a court of 71 and not a normal court of 23. Kohen Gadol. So Minani Mili, and we touched on this before. Where do we know that a Kohen Gadol is tried by a court of 71 if he sins in some sort of a capital way? So Amar Avada Barahava, da Amar Kra. So the pasuk tells us where Moshe Rabbeinu is instructed by Yitro, Kol hadavar hagadol yaviu elecha. Any big matter will be brought to you. Now Moshe is like a court of 71. So we don't interpret it literally, which means that a difficult topic will be brought to you, but rather, Dvarav Shel Gadol, matters of the leaders, of the great ones. In the context here, as we said before, was talking about the Nasi, but it's a similar idea here. We're saying it refers to if the Kohen Gadol needs some sort of a judgment by a court for capital punishment, he needs to go in front of a court of 71. Asks the Gemara, I'll show you a Braita who does not expound the pasuk like that. Rather expounds it kipshuto, because meitevei, the kash is like this. Davar gadol, when it says in the pasuk, davar gadol, what does it mean? Moshe will judge the great things. It doesn't mean that the matters of the Kohen Gadol or the leaders are judged by Moshe, by the court of 71, but rather davar kasheh. It just means the difficult matters are judged by Moshe Rabbeinu. Continues the Braita, Ata omer davar kasheh. You want to say that the simple pshat which we're trying to challenge Rav Bar Ahava's explanation, it means only the difficult things, or maybe like Rav Bar Ahava said, it means the matters of the Kohen Gadol are judged by the court of 71. Kishahu Omer, but you can't say that, because later, when it says they executed on this, and they set up the system like Yitro had said, later it says in that parasha, Et hadavar hakasheh yevi'un el Moshe. The difficult things were brought to Moshe Rabbeinu. It clearly says kasher there. Harei davar kasher amor. You see clearly what was it that Moshe took care of? Not dvarav shel gadol, the matters of the Kohen Gadol, but what does gadol really mean? As it's explained later, it means dvarav kasher. It means the difficult things, not the matters of the Kohen Gadol. So asks the Gemara, how can you explain? You're an Amora, Rav Bar Ahava. How can you explain the verse this way? Davar gadol means the matters of the Kohen Gadol, and that's our source for the Mishnah, that his capital cases are adjudicated by a court of 71. If Davar Gadol is explained by the Braita, means difficult matters. So the Gemara answers, no problem. Because Rav Bar Ahava is indeed an Amora, but he has a different Tana who backs him up and expounds the verse as he's trying to say. So he follows the following author. The Tanya that the Braita teaches us, Davar Gadol, what does it mean? Dvarav shel Gadol. It means that the 71-person court, as Moshe represents, is judged. They would judge the cases of the Kohen Gadol. You want to say that's what it means? Continues the Braita. Maybe it means kipshuto, more difficult cases. The answer is actually from that proof later. Since later it says that later Moshe would adjudicate difficult things, harei davar kasher amor. So that teaches us that the more difficult things were judged by Moshe Rabbeinu. Hamani mekayem. So then why does the Torah say earlier davar gadol? What is that referring to? It's a separate thing than davar kasher. Dvarav shel gadol. Says this Braita, it means the matters of the Kohen Gadol are adjudicated when he has a capital case by the 71-person court. So the second Braita actually, he says the fact that it mentions different between kasher and gadol. Kasher means the difficult things. Gadol means that they would adjudicate the cases of the Kohen Gadol. And that's a proof, a support to Rav Bar Ahava, and it fits into our Mishnah as well. Asks the Gemara, V'hai Tana, but the first Braita, Trei krai lamali. Why do there need to be two psukim? That one that says davar gadol and one that says davar kasher, if it's essentially the same thing. So the Gemara answers, simple pshat. Chad letzava be'alma v'chad la'asiyah. One was the command where Yitro suggested this to be done, and the other was when it was executed. So initially it was telling Moshe, you should take care of the more difficult cases, and in conclusion, that's what Moshe did. Ve'idach, but the second Braita who disagrees, he says that can't be the pshat, because if that's true and it's the same thing, lichtov, it should write, o gadol gadol, keep the word consistent. Either say, Yitro commanded Moshe to take care of davar gadol, and then he took care of davar gadol, o kasha kasha, or Yitro told Moshe to take care of kasha, and then he took care of kasha. Why does it change the language? My gadol o my kasha, shma min atarti. So therefore the second Braita says, it must be, which Rav Bar Ahava is supported by, it's two different things. That Moshe took care of the difficult matters, but he also was required to adjudicate cases of capital punishment for the Kohen Gadol, as our Mishnah is explaining. Now Rabbi Elazar is about to pose a very interesting she'ela, a very interesting question. He says like this. We know, regarding shor haniskal, if an ox, we spoke about this before, if an ox killed a person, we brought the proof to this before. An ox killed a person, so the ox needs to be judged by a court and to be put to death. And as we deduced earlier, the pasuk tells us, "V'gam ba'alav yumat." We compared the death of the ox to a person who killed. Just as if his owner killed, the owner is adjudicated with the court of 23, capital punishment. So too, the owner's ox, if it killed, it's also adjudicated, it's judged in a court of 23. So the Gemara now wonders, if the ox of a Kohen Gadol killed, do we say, just like if his owner killed, the ox's owner killed, he'd be adjudicated in a court of 71. So the ox also needs to be judged by a court of 71. Or do we say, pshat, in general, what the pasuk is saying is, like regular owners, not like a Kohen Gadol necessarily, and the ox still would only be adjudicated in a court of 23. Let's see that question inside. By Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar asked the following question. Sheila. Shoro shel Kohen Gadol bekama. If the ox of a Kohen Gadol killed somebody, how many people would be on the court to judge it to be put to death? Limitat ba'alim didei medamin. Do we compare it to its owners, and therefore you need a court of 71 to adjudicate its case? Or Dilmor, perhaps limitat ba'alim de'alo medamin. It means to say general owners, and you only need a court of 23. So Amar Abaye. Now the Gemara does not resolve this question, but Abaye deduces from the way that Rebbe Lazar asked the question. Amar Abaye, the fact that Rebbe Lazar only asked this question regarding a Kohen Gadol's ox that killed, it implies this would only be a havamina, a thought regarding an ox of a Kohen Gadol that killed. But regular monetary laws of a Kohen Gadol, as we spoke out before, it's pashut, that would be like normal people, and a Kohen Gadol's monetary laws would be adjudicated in a court of 3. Michlal de mamono, that his normal monetary law, pshitale, it's obvious to Rebbe Lazar, that's adjudicated in a court of 3. So Gemara says, Pshita, Abaye, what are you saying? Of course that's obvious. That's a logical conclusion from the words of Rebbe Lazar. So the Gemara says, no, it's not so simple. Because Ma'od you may have said, Ho'il v'katav, since the Torah says, which is where this Tana gets this idea, that a Kohen Gadol is adjudicated in a court of 71, it says Kol Hadavar Gadol, all great matters. And the way they expound is all matters of the Kohen Gadol. So you might think, Kol Dvarav Shel Gadol, you might think that it means any matters of the Kohen Gadol, whether it's capital or monetary, it's adjudicated in a court of 71. So Kamash Malon, that's what Abaye is saying, is Rebbe Lazar was only asking a question regarding his shore that kills. Monetary law, it's obvious though, that's what Abaye is concluding. The fact that he doesn't ask the question in that regard, that would only be adjudicated by a court of 3, like normal monetary law, Kohen Gadol would not be an exception. Let's move on to the third and final section today. Now, the Mishnah had told us that ein motzi'in milchemet hareshut ela b'shivim ve'echad, is that when the LLP Beit Din shel shivim ve'echad, the Jewish people were not allowed to go out to voluntary wars, which Rashi explains means any wars besides for the original wars of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael in the days of Yoshua ben Nun. They weren't allowed to go out unless they were given permission by the court of 71. So one of the necessary steps, we'll see actually there were a few steps, before they'd go out to voluntary wars was, which is everything besides for Yeshua ben Nun under his reign, when they conquered Israel, was with the consent of the Sanhedrin Agdolah. So the Gemara says, Menani Mili, how do we know this? What's the source for this? So Amar Rabbi Avod, Amar Kra, Pasuk tells us, now this Pasuk is talking about when Moshe Rabbeinu inaugurated Yoshua, means he was commanding him that he would become the king, and he was also telling him that when you're going to go out to battles, this is going to be the procedure. So what did it say? It says in the Pasuk there as follows. V'lefnei Elazar HaKohen Ya'amod, he will stand in front of Elazar the Kohen. Elazar will be the Kohen Gadol after Aaron HaKohen. Now the Psukim continue and say who, he. Now who is referring to Yoshua? So Zem Melech, this refers to the king, meaning Yoshua ben Nun. V'chol b'nei Yisrael ito, all of the Jewish people with him. Zem Mashuach Milchama. This refers to, there was a special Kohen who was appointed, the anointed Kohen for war, who would motivate the Jewish people and tell them certain instructions. So he was also involved in this procedure of going out to war. The Kol Eida and all of the congregation, Zeh Sanhedrin. This refers to the Sanhedrin. Now the assumption we're making right now is, when you go out to war, Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, Yoshua, you have to consult with the Sanhedrin, referring to the 71-person court. And this is a source that when they would go out to milchemet hareshut, that you need the 71-person court to be involved. Now the issue that Rabbeinu Yonah points out, which was before the Kasha of the Gemara, is that this can't be a proof, because as we just mentioned from Rashi, milchemet Yoshua, when he conquered Israel, was milchemet mitzvah. That wasn't milchemet hareshut. And you're telling me that you had to consult with the Sanhedrin. How does that prove to us that for milchemet hareshut you need to consult with the Sanhedrin? So Rabbeinu Yonah gives a few answers, one of them being that really the Gemara knew this wasn't a good answer, as it's about to refute this answer from a different source, and therefore it didn't feel the need to even ask that question. So the Gemara says, practically this is not a good source, because Vidilma, perhaps that's not what the Pasuk is talking about. It doesn't mean that when you go out to voluntary wars, you have to consult with the Sanhedrin, but rather, L'Sanhedrin hudika amar lahu rachmana, the merciful one Hashem is telling the Sanhedrin, that they had the opportunity to ask of the Urim Mitzumim. As Rashi explains here, maybe this has nothing to do with milchemet hareshut. Really, milchemet hareshut, you don't need to ask the 71-person court. What it's saying is, if somebody wants to ask the Urim Mitzumim, which was again this special name of Hashem that's in the breastplate, in the choshen, between the flap, that would allow you to ask a question and get an answer from Hashem, the stones would light up as an answer, you weren't allowed to unless you were somebody special. As Rashi explains, maybe if you were part of Sanhedrin, or the king, or the Meshuach Milchama. But otherwise you weren't allowed to ask. But it has nothing to do with going out to milchemet hareshut, and this can't be a source necessarily. So Ella, the Gemara says, the source is based on a famous Gemara in Masechet Brachot, in the beginning of the Masechta, which teaches us the way that David HaMelech used to send his people out to war. And it says as follows, Ki hada amar Rav Acha bar Bizna amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida. Kinor hayat taloi lema'ala mimitato shel David. There was a harp hanging above the bed of David HaMelech. We'll ultimately get to the proof in a minute, but first we talk about his avodah in the morning. Kivan she'egia chatzot laila, when the middle of the night would come. And as Rashi explains, the four winds of the day blow at different times, but in midnight, the northern wind would blow. So they had this harp facing towards the northern wind, ruach tzfonit min shevet bo, and the northern wind would blow through the harp, vayamin ageh me'elav, and it would cause the harp to play by itself. Immediately David would get up from his sleep and he would be involved in Torah till dawn, till the morning would arrive. Kivan shalamud hashachar. When Amud HaShachar would arrive, so his advisors would come to him. And Amrullah, they would tell the king. Now, it doesn't sound like this happened every day, but this was a common thing. They'd tell David HaMelech, Adonenu HaMelech, our master, the king, Amcha Yisrael tzrichim leparnasa. Your nation Israel needs sustenance. We need food. There's not enough food for everyone to be taken care of. Amar Lehen, so he would say, Lechu v'yitparnasu zeh mizeh. Go and support each other, means do business with each other so everyone's taken care of. Amrullah, the people, the Chachamim would say to David, the handful of food does not satiate a lion. And a pit cannot be filled up with the sand that was removed from it. If you dig a hole in the ground, you take the dirt and try to put it back in, it won't fill it up because there's some natural losses. But essentially what they were saying to David was, there's not enough resources within our own society to sustain everyone. So Marlem, David would then tell them, Lechu pishtu yedechem bigdud. Go and stretch your hand out in battle, which means you can go conquer surrounding territories and use their resources, which is milchemet hareshut, to support the Jewish people. Miyad immediately, yoatzin ba'achitofel. So they would take counsel from Achitophel. This was before Achitophel turned against David HaMelech, as we've spoken about. And this was, Achitophel was an advisor. Vinim lachin, he was the strategist for war. So they would first take counsel from him. Vinim lachin b'Sanhedrin, this is why we're bringing this whole thing in. And they would get permission from the Sanhedrin of 71. This is the source that in order to go to milchemet hareshut, which this is considered, you need to consult with the Sanhedrin. V'shoalim be'urim tumim, and then they would consult, they would ask of the urim tumim, the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, in order to know if Hashem is agreeable to this as well. Amar Rav Yosef Maikra, so Rav Yosef says, where do we find in the Psukim a reference to this procedure, these three steps? So the Gemara says, because it says in Divrei Yamim, turning to Tet Zayin Amud Bet, Va'acharei Achitophel, after they spoke to Achitophel, the war strategist, Benayahu ben Yoyada, they would consult with Benayahu ben Yoyada, who we'll see as a reference to the Sanhedrin, because he was, as Rashi says here, Muflash beBeitin, the greatest of the Beitin, or as Rashi in Brachot says, he was the Av Beitin, the head of the Sanhedrin, Ve'Evyatar, and then they would speak to Evyatar, who was the Kohen Gadol, referring to Urim and Tumim, V'Sar Tzva leMelech Yoav, and then the officer of battle, which was officer of the king, which was Yoav. They would go out to war. So the Gemara explains, Achitophel Zeyoetz, Achitophel was the war strategist. That was step number one. V'cheinu Omer, like it says in Shmuel Bet, V'atzat Achitophel asher ya'atz v'gomer, the advice of Achitophel who provided counsel. Benayahu ben Yehoyada is a Sanhedrin. So Sanhedrin. Benayahu ben Yehoyada was the head of the Sanhedrin, so it refers to consulting with Sanhedrin. And then the third step was Evyatar Elu Urim Mitumim. This refers to the Urim Mitumim. V'cheinu Omer, like it says in Divrei Hayamim, Benayahu ben Yehoyada. First, Benayahu ben Yehoyada, the Sanhedrin, ala Kreti v'ala Pleti, and then the Kreti and the Pleti. The Urim Mitumim is called Kreti u'Pleti. V'lama nekra shman Kreti u'Pleti. Why was it called that? Kreti shekortin divreyan. The Kreti is because it was very succinct. It said short, clear words, which is when the Urim Mitumim would give a message, it would be very short and precise. Kortin means to cut very precisely. Clear. Short. U'Pleti, and the Urim Mitumim was called Pleti, shemufla'in ma'aseim, because their deeds were wondrous. It's a pella. And then afterwards, they would go out to war with the general of the king, which was Yoav. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Breder of Ada, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avodimi, Micro. What's the source that David HaMelech would wake up in this way, middle of the night, and serve Hashem? Because it says in the pasuk in Tehillim, Ura kevodi, be aroused my honor. Means I wake up, I put aside my own honor, and I wake up in middle of the night. Ura nevel v'kinor. I am woken up by the navel and kinor. These are different instruments. Navel is I looked it up, it's called a psalter in English. Psalter. Some I saw explain it's them at a box harp, I believe. Some sort of a stringed instrument. And then the pasuk says, A'ira shachar, I wake up before the morning. When the Gemara in Brachot explains what David HaMelech was saying was, unlike other kings who sleep till 3 hours into the day, which we know actually has impact on the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema in the morning. Nonetheless, there's Yeshua's opinion actually. Nonetheless, I, said David HaMelech, I wake up in the middle of the night in order to, as the Gemara in Brachot tells us, sing songs of praises to Hashem, learn Torah, serve Hashem. I put aside my own honor and I wake up before the morning. So that's the source that David HaMelech used to engage in this way. But the bottom line is, what we do see is that the Sanhedrin was consulted when they would go out to milchemet hareshut. We're going to stop here. Ted Zayin Amud Bet towards the top of the page, and we'll pick up tomorrow with Ted Zayin Amud Bet. In the meantime, I wish everybody a wonderful day.